They told you the dead keep their secrets. That's a lie. The dead scream. They scream through paper, through bone, through the quiet places no one dares to look. What I'm about to show you is not a story. It's a fracture in the clean, polite version of history you were taught, and once you've seen inside, you can't go back. You'll recognize the patterns. You'll hear the echoes in places you thought were safe. Autumn 1863, northern Pennsylvania. A dirt road disappears into the hills. County officials ride out to serve eviction papers on a strange little settlement called Harmonia Springs. The air smells of damp leaves and coal smoke from far-off mines. But when they arrive, there is no one to greet them. 23 houses stand silent, doors swinging open in the wind. The ground crunches with frost. In the center of town, a 3-story brick medical facility looms over the empty streets, its windows black and hollow. They step inside. The air is thick with the sour tang of chemicals. Desks still hold open ledgers. The floor creaks under their boots as they move from room to room. Then they find the files, row after row of patient records, detailed measurements of skulls, diagrams of twisted limbs, notes in a precise European hand. Dates stretch back 15 years. These were not ordinary medical treatments. They were experiments. Behind the main building on a low hill, the ground is disturbed. They dig. The first small coffin comes up light, too light. Inside, the skeleton of a child, ribs warped like a crushed birdcage, skull elongated, jaw misaligned. They keep digging. More graves, more deformities no local physician has ever seen. Back in the building, among scattered papers, a leather-bound journal lies open. The final entry is only 5 words. Written by a young woman named Sarah Brennan, they will haunt the investigation for decades. We were brother, and sister. What happened in Harmonia Springs between 1856 and 1871 was so methodically evil that 3 separate congressional inquiries tried to bury it, not because they couldn't explain it, but because they could, and they decided you should never know. Tonight, we open the file they closed. It didn't begin with horror. It began with a promise, the kind that feels like salvation when you're desperate enough to believe anything. Pennsylvania, 1856. The state was bleeding men and money. The Industrial Revolution had turned cities into smoke-choked furnaces. Mines collapsed weekly, crushing men beneath black rock. Textile factories ate workers' fingers. Disease ate their lungs. A man could be 29 and look 50. Medicine was little more than superstition wrapped in Latin. And then came the stranger. Dr. Cornelius Engelhardt arrived like a figure from another world. Tall, silver-haired, European-trained, speaking of new sciences no one had heard of but everyone wanted to believe. He spoke of heredity, of bloodlines, of purifying the flaws passed down through generations. He had money, more than any doctor in the county, enough to buy 800 acres of farmland along a quiet creek without haggling a cent. There was a natural spring there, sulfur-tinged, which he swore had healing properties. By spring, workers were building a settlement from the ground up. 36 houses, arranged in perfect geometric order, surrounding a great brick medical hall. Engelhardt paid the laborers double the usual rate, but only if they signed contracts swearing to keep their mouths shut about what they were building. Then came the advertisements, printed in German-language newspapers, nailed to postboards in mining towns. He sought families of good moral character burdened by hereditary illness. In exchange for joining his settlement, he offered room, board, work, and preventive care for children, all free. Desperate letters poured in. Parents described twisted limbs, club feet, cleft palates, seizures. In another time, these children would have been hidden away in back rooms or left to die quietly in poorhouses. Here, Engelhardt promised they would be healed. The first families arrived in winter. They found clean homes with indoor pumps, warm stoves, and a doctor who examined their children with a gentleness that made mothers cry. Within months, pale cheeks flushed with color, twisted legs began to straighten, seizures became rare. But there were rules. You didn't leave without permission. Mail came through the doctor's office, visitors were discouraged, and every Tuesday night everyone gathered in the meeting hall for Englehart's lectures, where he spoke not just of medicine, but of the science of breeding. He called it hereditary optimization. At first, no one understood what that meant. They would, and by then, it would be too late. For months, the Tuesday lectures felt harmless. Engelhart spoke with the conviction of a preacher and the vocabulary of a scientist. He drew diagrams on the chalkboard, showed charts and sketches of bones and faces. Most of the families couldn't follow the details, but they understood the message. Sickness wasn't random, it was inherited, and it could be corrected. He told them that all living things carried an essence in the blood, a blueprint of strength or weakness, and just as a farmer selects the healthiest seeds, so should mankind select the healthiest unions. In Harmonious Springs, he promised, children would be born stronger than their parents, perfected. The first sign that his theories were not just talk came in September 1858, when he announced the first marriage. Sarah Graeber was 18. She had come to the settlement plagued by seizures so severe she could barely walk unassisted. Under Englehart's care, the fits had vanished. Her cheeks were full, her hair long and shining. She was smart, gentle, and every parent in the settlement saw her as proof that the doctor's methods worked. Her match was William Brennan, 21, a carpenter who had once been too sickly to lift a hammer. Now he was strong enough to work 12-hour days. Engelhart claimed their bloodlines were a perfect match. The wedding was unlike anything the settlement had seen. Flowers, music, a white dress ordered from Philadelphia. The doctor himself performed the ceremony, weaving his own vows into the tradition. Sarah and William swore not only to love and honor each other, but to honor the sacred principles of hereditary science and raise their children according to the laws of natural optimization. It sounded like a poetic flourish. No one thought twice. What they didn't know was that Engelhart had chosen them for another reason. In his private journal, he recorded them, not as bride and groom, but as subjects 3A and 3B. He noted their shared parentage, fraternal twins separated as infants, raised apart, unaware of the truth. Their reunion was no accident. It was part of what he called Experiment Series 3. They moved into a small house on the eastern edge of the settlement, filled with hope. Sarah planted flowers in the yard. William built a cradle for the child they both prayed would be the settlement's first perfect birth. Engelhart was praying for something else entirely. 2 months after the wedding, Sarah was pregnant. Engelhart treated the news like a victory parade. He told the settlement this was proof that science, not chance, governed the health of future generations. But behind closed doors, Sarah's pregnancy was nothing like the gentle miracle she'd imagined. She vomited until her lips split. Headaches left her blind for hours. Sometimes William found her sitting motionless, eyes fixed on a corner of the room, as if she were listening to something he couldn't hear. On June 21st, 1859, the summer solstice, she went into labor. It lasted 36 hours. Her screams could be heard across Harmonious Springs. When the midwife, Charlotte Penny, finally brought the child into the light, she froze. The boy's skull was elongated, almost conical, with a sharp ridge running along the top. His eyes, one brown like Sarah's, one green-gray like William's, seemed to drift in separate directions, never quite meeting. And his hands, the fingers were fused together, forming paddle-like shapes that Charlotte had to cut apart while the newborn wailed. William sobbed in the corner, but Engelhart was calm, too calm. He stepped forward with calipers, measuring the baby's head, jotting numbers into his ledger. He weighed the boy, turned him over, pressed on his joints, all while murmuring observations only he understood. To him, this wasn't a tragedy, it was data. He told the parents the abnormalities were variations of expression, nothing more. With treatment, he promised, the child would grow strong. He prescribed skull massages, electrical stimulation, and a special feeding formula prepared in his locked laboratory. Sarah named him Thomas, but within the settlement, people whispered, Other births had begun to take on strange patterns. The Zimmerman twins were born with curved spines that made them cry without pause. The Yoder boy had a cleft palate so severe he couldn't feed naturally. The Herzberger baby's joints bent backward, like a puppet strung wrong. Between 1859 and 1861, 12 children were born. 7 died before they turned 1. The causes listed on their graves were vague: constitutional weakness, hereditary insufficiency, failure to thrive. The cemetery on the hill grew. Parents visited at twilight when Engelhardt's assistants wouldn't see them. They whispered questions they didn't dare speak in daylight. But always the doctor had an answer. Always it was the fault of the past, the contaminated blood of their ancestors. And always, he said, the cure was to keep going. By 1861, Harmonia Springs no longer felt like a place people had joined. It felt like a place they had been claimed. The rules had tightened. No one left without written permission from Engelhardt himself. The gate at the road was manned day and night by 2 of his assistants, broad-shouldered men who had no medical training but followed orders with military precision. Mail was still collected centrally, but now letters arrived already opened, the seals neatly slit. Visitors were all but non-existent. Some families began to talk about leaving, but leaving meant breaking the contract. And breaking the contract meant forfeiting your home, your job, and according to Engelhardt, the treatments that were keeping your children alive. That was his most effective chain: the children. If a mother hinted at departure, Engelhardt would call her to his office. He'd lay her child's medical chart on the desk, pointing to columns of numbers, sketches of bones. Then, softly, he'd tell her that without the regimen, the baths, the supplements, the apparatuses, the illness would return, perhaps worse than before. In a town that already believed their children were born damaged, the thought of making them sicker was enough to crush rebellion before it started. And there was another kind of pressure, quieter but heavier. Every Tuesday, in the meeting hall, Engelhardt reminded them they were pioneers in a great human experiment, that the survival of future generations depended on their cooperation. He spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of leaving behind a legacy greater than themselves. The words were delivered in the same calm, confident tone that had once given them hope. But now, that tone was starting to sound like a verdict. In the evenings, some parents sat on their porches and listened to the wind move through the trees. Others sat in silence in their kitchens, waiting for the sound that had become a fixture of life in Harmonia Springs, the thin, desperate wail of another child born wrong. It was during this time that whispers began about pairing season. Engelhardt was studying more than illnesses. He was watching the teenagers, measuring, photographing, taking notes on their posture, their teeth, their gait. Some parents wondered why, others already knew. And a few, the ones who had been there longest, looked at their children and wondered if they had been born or made. The first challenge to Engelhardt's authority didn't come from an outsider. It came from a father who had once been his most devoted supporter. Johannes Zimmermann had arrived in Harmonia Springs with a boy whose legs were so bowed he could barely stand. Under Engelhardt's care, Peter's legs had begun to straighten. Johannes saw it as a miracle. For years he defended the doctor against every whisper of doubt. Until his twin daughters were born. Eva and Emma came into the world in January 1860, their spines twisted in identical curves that made breathing difficult. They cried constantly. Johannes tried to believe the doctor's assurances that this was a temporary expression of hereditary strain. But by the girl's first birthday, nothing had changed. When Johannes told his wife they should leave, she stared at him as if he'd suggested killing the children. "You heard him," she said. "Without treatment, they will die." So Johannes went to the doctor. Witnesses later said the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Johannes emerged from the medical hall pale, his hands shaking. He never spoke publicly about what was said, but 2 days later he was gone. His wife and children remained. No one saw him leave, and no one saw where he went. Engelhardt told the settlement that Johannes had returned to his extended family in Philadelphia, overcome by the strain of raising sick children. His tone was sympathetic, but the message was clear. Those who could not shoulder the responsibility had no place here. After that, no one openly spoke of leaving. Instead, the discontent went underground. Parents exchanged quick glances when the doctor passed. They lowered their voices when discussing their children's worsening conditions. The most dangerous act they could commit was sharing doubts. Engelhardt didn't need fences or chains. His power was built on dependency, on the vows, fear that outside these walls, sickness and poverty waited like wolves, and he was the only one who could keep them at bay. By the summer of 1862, Harmonia Springs had become a closed loop. Every marriage was arranged, every pregnancy was monitored, every child was born into the experiment without ever knowing it. And when the first generation of children reached maturity, the next phase began. The phase Engelhardt had been planning since the day he arrived. The summer of 1862 was marked by an unusual announcement. Engelhardt summoned the settlement to the meeting hall and told them Harmonia Springs had reached a critical juncture in its mission. The first children born under his guidance were now entering adulthood. Their enhanced constitutions, he claimed, were proof that selective pairing could undo centuries of hereditary decay, but the work was far from complete. He spoke of the founding mandate, a phrase no one had heard before, and explained that each new generation must be stronger than the last. To achieve this, the next round of marriages would be carefully arranged based on medical analysis. The room was silent. Most of the young men and women sat stiffly in their chairs, their parents staring straight ahead. In Harmonia Springs, there were no outsiders to marry. Every eligible partner was someone you had grown up beside, someone who might even be a cousin. Engelhardt anticipated the discomfort. He reassured them that science had determined compatibility with precision. Blood samples, bone measurements, and pedigree assessments, his term, would guide the pairings. Love, he said, was a product of health, not the other way around. A month later, the selections were announced in a ceremony that felt more like a religious rite than a scientific procedure. At the front of the hall, a long table was draped in white linen. On it lay a leather-bound book, the Registry of Bloodlines. One by one, the young people were called forward. Engelhardt would take their hand, speak their full name, then read aloud the name of their intended partner. The couple would stand side by side while he recited their combined hereditary potential in percentages and ratios, as though he were discussing the yield of a crop. Then they were told to join hands and pledge themselves to the advancement of the human stock. Pairings drew murmurs. A girl promised to a man twice her age. A boy joined with a cousin he barely knew, but no one protested. To protest was to challenge the doctor's judgment, and that was unthinkable. After the ceremony, the matched pairs were instructed to begin courtship under his supervision. They were given homes, supplies, and strict instructions on how to prepare for optimal conception. That night, one of the newly paired young women was overheard telling her mother she felt like livestock at a fair. Her mother told her to hush before someone heard, because in Harmonia Springs, the wrong words could make you disappear. The first marriage under the founding mandate was between Lydia Herzberger and Samuel Yoder. Lydia was 17, sharp-eyed and quick to laugh. Before the pairing, she'd been seen walking with a boy named Isaac Bauer, the kind of walking that meant something in a place where options were few. But Isaac was not on Engelhardt's list. Samuel was. Samuel was 28, quiet, with a left hand twisted from birth into a claw. He had no parents. They died in his infancy, one from illness, the other from an accident at the mill. Engelhardt had raised him in the boarding house, tutoring him in anatomy and mechanics. The ceremony was small, held in the same meeting hall where the pairing was announced. There was no music, no feast, just the vows dictated by the doctor, binding them in service to the lineage. Isaac did not attend. Some said Engelhardt had sent him on an errand to the far edge of the settlement that morning. Others believed he'd been warned. Lydia moved into Samuel's cabin that night. Neighbors said she kept the curtains drawn during the day, and the light in her window burned late into the night. Within 3 months, she was pregnant. When the child was born, the settlement whispered again. His face was narrow, his nose sharp, but his eyes were wide and startlingly pale, almost silver. He seldom cried. In fact, he seldom made any sound at all, watching the world with a stillness that made even adults uneasy. Engelhardt, however, was pleased. He noted that the boy's grip was exceptionally strong for his age, and that his reflexes were remarkably precise. He named him Jonas, after a scientist none of the settlers had heard of, and took personal charge of his development. Lydia began to fade. Her laughter was gone, replaced by a hollow way of speaking, as if she were reading from a script. Samuel seemed oblivious, or perhaps unwilling to see. By the end of the year, Jonas was spending more time in the doctor's laboratory than with his parents. Lydia sometimes stood outside the locked door, listening. Once, a passerby claimed they heard her whisper, "I want him back." But in Harmonia Springs, once a child belonged to Engelhardt's experiment, they never truly belonged to their parents again. Jonas Yoda was only 3 years old when Engelhardt began calling him the Proof. The boy could walk before most children could crawl. By the age of 2, he could recite the names of every plant in the settlement garden in Latin. He had an uncanny stillness. He never fidgeted, never asked the same question twice. If Engelhardt showed him how to do something once, Jonas could repeat it perfectly. The other children, by comparison, seemed clumsy, loud, and forgetful. Parents began to look at their sons and daughters differently, not with less love, but with a creeping sense that something was wrong with them, that they were somehow behind before their lives had even begun. Engelhardt encouraged this quiet competition. He often brought Jonas to the meeting hall during gatherings, letting him stand beside the lectern while he spoke. Sometimes Jonas would be asked to read aloud from the registry of bloodlines, his small voice steady and sure. Other times, he'd be made to demonstrate a skill, solving a puzzle, assembling a tool, even identifying which adults in the room were genetically optimal based on their posture and complexion. Parents who once questioned Engelhardt's methods now wondered how to get results like Jonas, and the doctor was ready with answers. Consistency, he'd say, regimen, discipline, remove all contaminants, physical and moral, from the child's environment. Some took this to heart in ways that bordered on cruelty. Meals became measured. Playtime was replaced with rote learning. Physical affection dwindled, replaced by the cold reward of approval. The settlement's children were no longer just being raised, they were being cultivated. Jonas, for all his precision, did not smile often, but when Engelhardt looked at him, there was pride. A pride so intense it unsettled even the most loyal families. There were rumors about where Jonas slept. Officially, he lived with Lydia and Samuel. Unofficially, many believed he spent more nights in the laboratory than at home. His mother's face seemed to grow thinner each season, her eyes sunken, her voice brittle. Once, when Lydia was seen walking toward the road that led out of Harmonia Springs, 2 of Engelhardt's assistants appeared beside her. They said nothing. She turned around without a word and went home. The settlement understood the message. Jonas was more than a child, he was an asset, and assets didn't leave. By the time Jonas turned 12, there was little left of the boy who had once clung to Lydia's skirts. He moved through Harmonia Springs with a measured gait, his hands clasped behind his back like an old man in a young body. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was with the clipped precision of someone reciting memorized lines. People began to notice he no longer addressed Samuel and Lydia as father or mother. In fact, he seldom addressed them at all. Most days, he could be found in the laboratory. Engelhardt had converted one of the upper rooms into a private study for him, a place of long tables, glass cases, and shelves stacked with books in languages Jonas was learning to read. When the other boys were mending fences or helping in the mill, Jonas was cataloguing preserved specimens, sketching anatomical diagrams, and studying maps of places far beyond the settlement's borders. There was an unspoken understanding that Jonas was being prepared for something greater. The doctor called it the succession, though he never explained exactly what that meant. He hinted that Jonas would one day oversee the registry of bloodlines himself, guiding the settlement into a new genetic era. Lydia seemed to shrink in his presence. She would watch him from a distance, her expression unreadable, as though she were looking at a stranger who happened to share her son's face. Samuel, if he felt the loss, kept it to himself. He had long since accepted the hierarchy. Jonas belonged to the doctor, not to them. The other children treated Jonas with a mixture of awe and fear. Some tried to imitate his speech and posture, hoping to earn the same attention. Others avoided him entirely, unsettled by his uncanny ability to remember details about them, the exact number of freckles on a cheek, the limp in a father's step, the way an older sister hesitated before answering a question. Engelhart encouraged Jonas to observe people this way. "You cannot guide what you do not understand," he told him, "and you cannot understand without watching." It was around this time that Jonas began keeping his own records, not just of plants and animals, but of people. He wrote down their illnesses, their family histories, even overheard conversations. He stored the notebooks in a locked drawer in his study. Only Engelhart had the key. By 13, Jonas was no longer just a model child. He was a living instrument of the doctor's will, sharp, precise, and loyal to no one but him. And that loyalty would soon be tested in a way neither of them could have predicted. It began with a sickness, not the kind that swept through a settlement in a week and burned itself out. This was slower, quieter, a wasting illness that started in the joints, then crept inward. The first to show symptoms was an older man named Elias Bauer, Isaac's father. His hands shook when he tried to work, and soon he could no longer lift a hammer. Engelhart examined him, then announced it was hereditary degradation, the result of poor pairing generations ago. His conclusion was final. Elias would not recover. More troubling, the doctor claimed, was that the trait might still be dormant in other bloodlines. Jonas was tasked with finding out who. Engelhart called it a study. He gave Jonas a list of names and told him to collect family histories, quietly without raising suspicion. It was the first time Jonas had been entrusted with work that could directly change someone's standing in the settlement. One of the names was Isaac Bauer. Jonas hadn't spoken to Isaac in years, but he remembered the man's voice from childhood, the way he laughed too loudly, the way he had once slipped Lydia an apple when she thought no one was looking. Isaac was married now, with a baby daughter who had just learned to walk. When Jonas visited under the guise of updating the registry, Isaac welcomed him in. They talked over tea while the little girl toddled around the table. She climbed into Jonas's lap without hesitation, placing her tiny hand against his cheek. Jonas felt something strange in that moment, a warmth he couldn't name, a pull towards something that wasn't measured in percentages or pedigree charts. That night he returned to the laboratory and wrote in his notes, "No sign of degradation in Isaac or child. Recommend removal from list." He left the page on Engelhart's desk. The next morning, the note was gone. In its place was a single instruction, Test A, gain, be certain. Jonas understood. This was not about certainty, it was about obedience. 2 weeks later, Isaac's family was gone. Officially, they had chosen to leave Harmonia Springs. Unofficially, everyone knew no one left without Engelhart's consent. Their house stood empty, the windows shuttered, the garden overgrown. Jonas never saw the little girl again, but sometimes, when he passed that abandoned cabin, he could still feel the warmth of her hand on his face, and that was the first crack in his loyalty. Jonas did not speak of the Bauer's disappearance, but something shifted in him after that. He still followed Engelhart's orders, still kept his records, still moved through the settlement with the same deliberate precision. Yet his observations began to change. Where once he had written only about bloodlines and defects, he now noted things the doctor would have called irrelevant. The way a mother hummed to her baby, the sound of boys playing near the creek, the relief in a man's eyes when a neighbor helped him repair a roof. He began storing these details in a separate notebook, not in the locked drawer, but hidden under a loose floorboard in his study. The more he wrote, the more he noticed a difference between Engelhart's data and the reality in front of him. The doctor's version of people was cold, flattened, reduced to strengths and weaknesses like entries in a ledger. But Jonas's hidden notebook showed something else, moments that didn't fit into any chart, things that could not be measured. At night, he would sit by the window in his study, looking out at the lamplight in the homes scattered across Harmonia Springs. He imagined what was happening behind those windows: arguments, laughter, prayers, secrets. He realized that while Engelhart had trained him to see, he had never taught him to feel. That part, Jonas was discovering on his own. It was during this time that Lydia began to speak to him more. Not in the open, but in passing moments. A murmured question in the garden, a whisper as she handed him bread at the table. Once, when they were alone, she asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder why he chooses who he chooses?" Jonas didn't answer, but the question followed him for days. Then came a pairing announcement that made the settlement uneasy. A girl of 15 matched with a man nearly 40. The man's last wife had died in childbirth, and whispers followed him like a shadow. Engelhart dismissed the concerns as emotional interference. Jonas found himself watching the girl during the weeks before her wedding. She walked with her head down, never meeting anyone's gaze. It was the same posture he had seen in his mother years ago. In his hidden notebook, Jonas wrote only 3 words beside her name: "This is wrong." It was the first time he had allowed judgment to enter his records. The wedding was set for the first Sunday after the harvest. In Harmonia Springs, that meant a public gathering in the meeting hall, followed by a feast in the square. Everyone would attend. No one refused a pairing, not openly. On the morning of the ceremony, Jonas woke before dawn. He moved through the dark house without lighting a lamp, careful not to wake Samuel or Lydia. In his study, he took out his hidden notebook and turned to the page with the girl's name. The words, "This is wrong," stared back at him like a challenge. He knew he couldn't stop the wedding, but he could buy her time. Jonas left the house and crossed the fields toward the edge of the settlement, where the mill stood beside the creek. The air was damp, smelling faintly of iron and wet wood. He found the girl there, fetching water before the day's preparations began. She froze when she saw him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Neither should you," he said, his voice low. "If you don't want this, leave today. Go before the sun's up." Her eyes darted toward the path leading out of Harmonia Springs, then back to him. "They'll follow me." "They won't. Not today," Jonas replied. "He'll be looking for you in the hall, not on the road." She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him. Then she set down her bucket and began walking, not toward the settlement, but toward the tree line. She didn't run. She didn't look back. Jonas watched until she vanished among the pines. By the time the meeting hall filled with guests, whispers had already started. The bride was missing. The groom paced like a caged animal. Engelhart sat at the front of the room, his expression unreadable, tapping one finger against the arm of his chair. Jonas kept his face still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, but inside he felt the slow rush of something he had never experienced before, the knowledge that he could act against Engelhart and still stand. He also knew this. The doctor would find out. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he would find out, and when he did, there would be no going back. Engelhart noticed the missing girl before anyone else did. He didn't ask directly. That wasn't his method. Instead, he studied the settlement with a precision that made even the most obedient workers uneasy. He watched the children play, the parents work, the young men and women preparing for chores, and he took mental notes of every deviation from his expected patterns. Jonas moved through the hall that morning, as if nothing had happened, his posture perfect, his gaze forward. But Engelhart's eyes lingered a little longer than usual. He had trained Jonas to observe, to catalogue, to obey, and yet he was beginning to sense something unusual in the boy's movements, a hesitation that wasn't there before. Later in the laboratory, Engelhart asked Jonas to deliver a series of reports. He handed them one by one, watching as Jonas handled each page. When Jonas placed the last ledger on the desk, Engelhart leaned forward, voice soft, almost casual, but carrying a weight that made the air thrum. "Jonas," he said, "you observed the girl yesterday, did you not?" Jonas's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the ledger. He forced himself to respond calmly. I noticed she was not in the hall, sir." Englehart's lips curved, almost imperceptibly. Noticed. Good. Observation is the first step. But I wonder... His gaze sharpened, and suddenly the room felt colder. Did you note where she went? Jonas kept his eyes down, hands folded, and swallowed the words he wanted to say. The doctor stood and walked slowly around the desk, his steps echoing in the quiet laboratory. You have been entrusted with knowledge that most cannot bear. Every observation you make is a reflection of yourself and of me. He stopped directly behind Jonas, so close that the boy could feel the faint scent of the lab's minerals. And yet, I fear there may be cracks in your reflection. I see hesitation, questioning. Jonas did not reply. He could feel the weight of every moment he had spent defying the orders, every secret note, every glance toward the girl he had helped escape. Englehart placed a hand on the ledger. Be careful, Jonas. Observation is your tool, but tools can cut their master if handled incorrectly. Jonas understood the warning. This was no longer about obedience or study. This was a test, and failing would mean exposure. By the end of the day, the entire settlement felt subtly shifted. The adults whispered to each other, children noticed the tension, and even the wind seemed to carry a strange weight through the halls. Jonas had stepped out of line, and now he would be watched. That night, Jonas could not sleep. The candle burned low on his desk, illuminating the hidden notebook under the floorboard. Every word he had written felt heavier than the last. The girl's face, the Bowers' disappearance, the secrets he kept for himself, they all pressed on his mind like a weight he could not set down. He understood clearly now. Englehart's gaze followed more than movement. It followed intent. A single slip, a pause, an expression too long on a face, and everything would unravel. Jonas considered the settlement, the children, the families who had come to trust him without knowing why. He thought of the trembling mothers, the exhausted fathers, the frightened children who looked to him for guidance because he carried the authority of Englehart's will, and he understood something chilling. To protect them, he would have to continue lying. To save even one life, he would have to accept that others might be lost. His mind replayed the moments with the escaped girl, her small hand in his, her trust in him, moments he could not forget. Each image drove home a terrible clarity. Doing nothing was not an option. Doing everything, however, was a calculated risk, a knife's edge he could not slip from. He thought of Englehart's words that morning. Tools can cut their master if handled incorrectly. Jonas realized that he himself was the tool now, honed, sharpened, and dangerous. But unlike other instruments in the laboratory, this one had thoughts and desires and instincts. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window. For a moment he saw not the obedient student, not the model child, but a young man shaped by impossible choices. A boy forced to live in a world designed by someone else, yet secretly carving a path of his own. Jonas's fingers brushed the floorboard, tracing the notebook beneath. He could not destroy it. It contained proof. No, just of the settlement's hidden horrors, but of the humanity Englehart could never quantify. He whispered to himself, barely audible, I cannot let him win, not all of them. And in that whisper, Jonas understood the truth. Every decision he made from this point forward would be a calculated act of rebellion. Every smile, every obedience, every measured step in the hall would be a mask, hiding the strategy slowly building in his mind. The candle guttered and flickered. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, whispering secrets to the night. Jonas felt a strange calm settle over him. He had chosen his path, and now nothing could stop the first move. The morning arrived with the same pale light that always touched Harmonia Springs, but nothing felt ordinary. Jonas had planned every detail the night before, testing the limits of Englehart's scrutiny, knowing a single misstep could end in exposure. He left his house early, carrying nothing but a small satchel and the hidden notebook. The settlement stirred around him, the hum of chores, the distant laughter of children, the clatter of tools in the mill. all unaware that the balance of power was about to shift. Jonas went first to the laboratory. Engelhardt was already there, reviewing charts and measurements, entirely absorbed. The doctor did not notice Jonas at first. He had grown so accustomed to obedience that any movement from the boy seemed natural, even expected. Jonas approached the table where a set of freshly prepared charts lay. He took a pen from the drawer, careful to mimic Engelhardt's handwriting, and made subtle annotations, marks that contradicted the doctor's official data, highlighting irregularities in the recent pairings, discrepancies that could not be ignored. Then he placed the notebook atop the ledger, the hidden one. Engelhardt's sharp eyes flicked to it almost immediately. "Jonas, what is this?" the doctor asked, voice calm but edged with suspicion. Jonas met his gaze steady. "Observations, sir. You instructed me to report anomalies. I have done so." Engelhardt reached for the notebook. His fingers paused over the cover. "This contains everything." Jonas nodded, the smallest tilt of his head. "Everything I could observe, including matters that may require reconsideration of certain matches." A silence fell, heavy and electric. Engelhardt's eyes scanned the pages, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he looked up. For the first time, he did not lecture, did not explain, did not instruct. He simply studied Jonas, and in that low oak was an acknowledgement, a recognition that this was no longer merely a student following orders. "You have taken initiative," Engelhardt said, voice low, almost admiring. "Do you understand the danger of this?" "I do," Jonas replied. "And I accept it." The doctor leaned back, tapping a finger against the table. "Very well. You will observe today, yes. But now, you will also choose your next actions carefully. Every choice from here forward carries consequence. The lives you protect, the lives you expose, all will be counted." Jonas felt something he had never felt before. Control. Not the control of a boy under tutelage, not the measured authority of someone guided by another's hand. Real power, deliberate and dangerous, coursed through him. He knew this was only the beginning. One small defiance, executed precisely, had changed everything. The shadows that had long dominated Harmonia Springs were no longer unchallenged. Jonas had begun his countermeasure, and now the game had shifted. By mid-morning, the settlement seemed unchanged. Children played, parents worked. The distant sound of the creek hummed through the crisp air. But Jonas moved differently now, aware of every glance, every gesture, every small interaction, as if the very rhythm of Harmonia Springs was a puzzle to be rearranged. He began quietly observing more than the charts. He watched how families spoke in whispers, how the children imitated Engelhardt's routines without understanding why, how loyalty was not just expected, it was enforced, silently, through fear. Small opportunities appeared, a mother struggling with her child's twisted leg, a boy hiding a bruise, a girl whose eyes darted too quickly toward the creek. Jonas stepped in, offering guidance or assistance in ways Engelhardt would never notice. He did not intervene openly. He acted in shadows, subtle and deliberate, leaving a trail of small victories that shifted the balance for those he protected. He began teaching the older children minor skills, how to move quietly through the woods, how to observe without being observed, how to communicate with a single look. It was harmless, he told himself, a preparation in case the day came when they would need to act for themselves. In the evenings, he circulated more among the families. He listened without judgment, offering the smallest reassurances, the tiniest glimmers of hope. They spoke freely to him, unaware that their words were being catalogued in his hidden notebook. Evidence of what humanity persisted despite Engelhardt's control. Even the adults began to notice changes. A mother straightened her back more confidently after a quiet word from Jonas. A father began questioning minor orders, only enough to see if they could be challenged safely. Small sparks, subtle but growing. Jonas felt the weight of every choice. Each action carried risk. If Engelhardt suspected Eve, and a fragment of intent, punishment would follow. Yet every small success, a child's cry stilled, a mother encouraged, a life momentarily spared, emboldened him. He realized something dangerous. The settlement could be influenced, not all at once, but incrementally, through trust, guidance, and careful risk. What Engelhardt had built on obedience and fear could be shifted by knowledge and subtle defiance. And in that realization, Jonas understood the truth that had been forming in his mind for weeks. One man could change the trajectory of an entire community, not by force, but by teaching them to see, to question, to act. By nightfall, the shadows in Harmonia Springs were no longer unchallenged. Jonas had begun to shape them. Engelhardt never underestimated observation. By late afternoon, he began noticing what others had missed. A whisper too long, a child's hesitancy, a slight defiance in a mother's posture, small, almost imperceptible, but to him they formed a pattern. He traced the ripples, connecting the dots only a mind like his could see. Jonas, as usual, moved with care, yet the doctor's scrutiny felt heavier now, like the weight of eyes pressed into the back of his skull. Engelhardt did not confront him yet. He did not need to. Instead, he prepared a subtle test, one designed not to expose openly, but to measure intent. He summoned Jonas to the laboratory under the pretense of reviewing the new data. The room smelled of minerals and ink, the familiar tang grounding but also sharpened every nerve. Engelhardt gestured toward the charts. These reports, Jonas, they reflect observations that require verification, and yet, his gaze lingered, studying the boy's face. I sense there may be discrepancies, perhaps intentional, perhaps not. Jonas kept his composure, nodding politely. I strive to be precise, sir. Engelhardt's lips curved faintly. Precision is not enough. Interpretation matters. Intent matters. Tell me, Jonas, what would you do if you discovered evidence that contradicted my findings? The words were quiet, measured, but in them was a challenge wrapped in a warning. The answer could not be truth, it could not be defiance, yet silence was also perilous. Jonas chose carefully. I would report it with context, sir, so that conclusions are fully informed. Engelhardt studied him, the flicker of a candle casting shadows across his sharp features. Good. Context. Observation. Yet, consider this. Observation is also influence. A subtle nudge, a minor correction, can create a cascade, and sometimes one must decide whether to allow the cascade or suppress it. Jonas felt too. The weight of the statement settled over him. The test was not whether he would act, but how he would think. Engelhardt was measuring judgment, patience, the very spark of independent thought. As he left the laboratory, Jonas realized the stakes had escalated. Every move, every small act of rebellion now had to be layered with strategy. One misstep would not just endanger him, it could unravel the entire subtle network he was building. And yet the danger only sharpened his resolve. He understood more clearly than ever that true defiance was not loud, it was deliberate, invisible. The shadows in Harmonia Springs were no longer mere absence of light. They were Jonas's arena, and Engelhardt had just raised the first real obstacle. That evening, Jonas walked quietly through the settlement, carrying the weight of the day like armor. Every step measured, every glance calculated. The test in the laboratory had revealed one critical truth. Engelhardt was watching, but he could not monitor every mind, every subtle exchange. Jonas began meeting families in private, under the guise of casual conversation. He spoke softly, never raising his voice, asking questions that seemed innocuous but planted seeds. "Have you noticed the changes in your children?" he would ask. Or, "Do you ever wonder if the treatments are affecting them differently than Engelhardt predicts?" At first the adults were cautious. Habits of obedience ran deep, but Jonas had learned the subtle art of trust. Listen first, affirm second, reveal nothing too quickly. He offered reassurance, small observations that validated their concerns without directly opposing Engelhardt. Mothers began to relax slightly in his presence. Fathers nodded, absorbing his insights as wisdom rather than rebellion. The children too became instruments in the quiet expansion. Jonas taught them small gestures, tiny signals to communicate silently. A glance, a tilt of the head, a shift in posture. They began to understand intuitively that there were hidden ways to act without drawing Engelhart's suspicion. Jonas was careful to avoid overt defiance. Every word, every movement was calculated to create subtle change while remaining invisible to the doctor. He planted the idea that knowledge and observation gave power, a power that did not need to be loud, but could be decisive when needed. By nightfall, the settlement had shifted imperceptibly. Families were more alert, more conscious of the patterns Engelhart imposed, and more willing to question minor directives internally. Jonas sensed it in the small exchanges, a mother giving a child a knowing nod, her pausing before carrying out an instruction, children whispering small observations in ways the adults only half understood. Jonas felt a dangerous thrill. Each subtle ripple he created moved the community toward awareness. Each private conversation, each hidden lesson became part of an invisible web. And yet he knew that Engelhart would sense these changes eventually. The challenge was not to avoid detection forever, but to shape the settlement before discovery became inevitable. He paused at the edge of the creek, looking out at the dark water that reflected the moonlight. In that stillness, Jonas understood something vital. Influence was not about open rebellion. Influence was about planting thought, nurturing it, and letting it grow unseen until the moment it could no longer be ignored. The shadows of Harmonia Springs were growing alive, and Jonas had begun to orchestrate them. The morning sun barely touched the eastern edge of Harmonia Springs when Engelhart summoned the community to the meeting hall. His presence filled the room like a silent storm, calm, controlled, but undeniably dangerous. Every face turned toward him, some with respect, others with a flicker of unease. Jonas felt the tension coil in his chest. He knew this was no ordinary lecture. Engelhart had a way of reading not just actions, but intention. The slightest hesitation, the subtlest doubt, he could detect it, and he had seen the ripples Jonas had begun to create. Today, Engelhart began, his voice smooth but sharp. We will conduct an exercise of trust and obedience. Each family will be presented with a task, one that requires judgment, loyalty, and adherence to our principles. Your actions will reveal the strength of your commitment. A murmur ran through the room. Parents glanced at one another nervously. Children fidgeted, sensing the tension but not understanding its depth. Jonas remained calm, his mind already calculating the possibilities, the risks, and the opportunities. The first task was deceptively simple. A child had hidden a small, valuable medical tool in the workshop, a test of obedience to Engelhart's strict inventory rules. The family had to locate it and return it without drawing attention or causing disruption. As each family stepped forward, Jonas observed closely. Some moved quickly, others hesitated, their uncertainty exposing cracks in the carefully constructed obedience Engelhart demanded. Jonas could see the subtle fear, the internal calculations, the private moments of decision that would reveal true alignment. When his own small group approached, Jonas offered no overt guidance. Instead, he provided a subtle signal, a glance, a quiet hand gesture, enough to tip them toward the correct action without appearing to intervene. The chill had retrieved the tool, and the family returned it without error, their confidence quietly bolstered by Jonas's invisible hand. Engelhart's eyes lingered longer on Jonas than on anyone else. The doctor's expression was unreadable, but Jonas felt the tension. This was a test of more than obedience. It was a measure of influence, of subtle power, of the ability to sway outcomes without detection. Jonas realized then that the settlement was no longer just a place of observation. It had become a battlefield of shadows and perception, where control was measured in the unseen, and the strongest hand was the one guiding silently. The test continued, each task escalating in subtle difficulty, forcing families to act under scrutiny. And through it all, Jonas's presence shaped their decisions, a hidden force steering the outcomes, expanding his influence even as Engelhart sought to contain it. By evening, Jonas understood the truth. The doctor's loyalty tests had become a tool for rebellion, if wielded correctly. Every eye that had hesitated, every whisper caught in shadow, now fell within Jonas's quiet network. Harmonia Springs was shifting, and Engelhart had unknowingly handed Jonas the instruments to accelerate it. Night settled over Harmonia Springs like a heavy cloak, thick and suffocating. In the quiet of his room, Jonas opened a small, hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside lay a notebook, blank pages waiting for the truths that could not be spoken aloud, the evidence that would one day shift the balance of power. He began recording everything. Every experiment Engelhart conducted, every manipulation of the families, every subtle coercion disguised as guidance. The journal became a map of hidden control, a ledger of deceit, each entry marked with dates, locations, and the names of those affected. Jonas understood that observation alone was insufficient. Knowledge without documentation was fleeting, evidence was power, and in the shadows of Harmonia Springs, power could mean survival. He wrote of the pairing of Sarah and William, of the calculated precision that determined their union, and of the horrifying reality that neither knew they were fraternal twins. He noted every adjustment Engelhart made to their environment, every correction to their behavior, every experiment disguised as care. Jonas recorded the deaths of infants with meticulous detail, not merely as numbers, but as the consequences of a system designed to control, to optimize, to observe. He catalogued reactions of parents, their subtle despair, their quiet hope, their growing suspicion. All data points in Engelhart's grand design, now repurposed as evidence. He even included his own interventions, small acts of rebellion, subtle nudges that shifted outcomes in ways Engelhart could not detect. Each action, each note, was a thread in a growing web, a network of truth that, once revealed, could dismantle the doctor's carefully constructed dominion. Jonas felt the weight of the task. Every word written was dangerous. If discovered, the consequences would be immediate and severe, yet the risk upend his focus. Danger was a necessary companion on the path to liberation. As he worked, he reflected on the families he had guided. Each one, unknowingly, was part of the proof he was collecting. Their lives, their struggles, their silent acts of defiance, all became testament to the truth Engelhart sought to suppress. By the time he closed the notebook, the room was dark except for a single flickering candle. Jonas knew that this journal was more than a record. It was a weapon. It was a blueprint for the eventual dismantling of control, a way to turn observation into action and shadows into leverage. Harmonia Springs had many secrets, but now one more would exist beyond Engelhart's grasp. The truth, meticulously documented, waiting for the moment it could strike. The following morning, Harmonia Springs carried an unusual tension. Even the creek's steady murmur seemed sharper, almost accusatory. Jonas sensed it immediately. Something had shifted. The subtle air of surveillance felt heavier, more deliberate. Engelhart's presence was different that day. He moved through the settlement with a quiet precision, watching families as though scanning for irregularities invisible to ordinary eyes. His gaze lingered on Jonas longer than necessary, sharp, calculating, as though reading more than posture or expression, reading intent itself. During the morning assembly, Engelhart's voice carried that same calm authority, but there was an edge now, a silent probe. "Jonas," he said, "your observations have been thorough. And yet, thoroughness can obscure perception. Sometimes it reveals more than it conceals. Would you agree?" Jonas met the gaze without flinching. "I aim to serve the settlement faithfully, sir," he replied evenly, careful to mask every flicker of thought. A faint smile crossed Engelhart's face, almost imperceptible, but Jonas felt its weight. The test was no longer theoretical. It had become personal. The doctor was probing, analyzing, searching for cracks, for traces of independent action beneath the surface of obedience. Throughout the day, Engelhardt's scrutiny intensified. Every task Jonas performed was observed. Every conversation he had with families seemed to be measured against an invisible scale. Subtle interruptions during work, casual gestures, even the way he distributed small comforts. Nothing escaped the doctor's notice. Jonas realized that his hidden network, the quiet web of influence he had been building, might be under threat. One careless act, one misread signal could unravel weeks of preparation, but fear was no longer a deterrent. It was a sharpening instrument. By mid-afternoon, he noticed it. Small hints of deliberate testing. Children were given tasks slightly more complex than usual. Parents were questioned in ways that seemed routine but carried implicit pressure. Jonas understood immediately. Engelhardt had noticed the subtle shift in dynamics and was probing for evidence of deviation. Yet Jonas also saw opportunity. The awareness of observation meant he could now direct Engelhardt's gaze, manipulate perception carefully, and reinforce loyalty while secretly strengthening the network of defiance. The balance of power was precarious, but within his control if he remained disciplined, patient, and invisible. As the sun dipped below the hills, Jonas understood the new reality. Engelhardt was no longer merely the architect of control. He was the opponent, actively testing, actively searching. The game had changed, and every shadow, every silence, every whispered glance now carried the weight of survival. Harmonia Springs had become a chessboard, and Jonas was calculating his moves with ruthless precision.